Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program seminar series. I see folks are just joining, so I'll give it a minute or so before we get started. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program seminar series. My name is Anisha Cindy. I am the Director of Research and Programs at WAP at Harvard Kennedy School, where our mission is to empower leaders and change makers with rigorous evidence-based research that advances women and gender equity. And this seminar is one of the ways in which we do that. Our seminar series this spring is called Make Work Fair and will feature researchers presenting their academic work that explores what workplaces that work for everyone might look like. And we're excited to co-sponsor this series with the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. Today, we are pleased to welcome the chairs of the seminar and co-authors of the recently published book, Make Work Fair, Iris Bohnet and Siri Chilazi. Iris Bohnet is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government and the co-director of the Women in Public Policy Program at Harvard Kennedy School. She is a behavioral economist, combining insights from economics and psychology to improve decision-making in organizations and society, often with a gender and cross-cultural perspective. Her most recent research examines behavioral design to embed equity at work. Professor Bohnet advises many boards, governments, and companies across the world on how to advance gender equity, and also currently serves as the faculty director of the social sciences at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Siri Chilazi is a senior researcher at the Women in Public Policy Program, and her life's work is to advance gender equality in the workplace through research and research translation. She operates at the intersection of academia and practice, both conducting research on how organizations can become more inclusive and bringing those research insights to practitioners through speaking, training, and workshops. In our seminar today, Iris and Siri will be presenting an introduction to the book, and we'll be discussing the evidence on some common approaches that have traditionally been used to advance fairness in organizations. Iris and Siri will present for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will have 20 minutes for questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will read your question out loud. Thank you both to Iris and Siri for leading the seminar series this semester and also the seminar today. We're really excited to learn from you both. And thank you for sharing your insights from your timely and ever important new book, Make Work Fair. I will now pass it to Iris.
Well, thank you so much, Anisha, for this very kind introduction. And as you know, your many contributions to the work are heavily featured in the book. So we are delighted for you to host us today, but also for you being a collaborator on some of the work that we have done. But hello to everyone else as well, from wherever you're joining from. Thank you for joining us today. This is the opening seminar of our seminar series that will meet every Monday, basically every Monday, unless there's a holiday here in the United States, but otherwise every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Siri and I would like to share a bit of an opening, really a warm-up for the seminar with you today. It is based on the introduction to our book, Make Work Fair, and the first chapter of Make Work Fair. As you will see in the seminar more generally, we will broadly base our topics on the chapters of the book, and I will preview that at the end of the seminar in case you want to read along. However, this is not a sales pitch, so you don't have to have the book in order to follow the seminar. We will have seminar speakers who present their own original research in every week. Sometimes we feature that research in the book. Sometimes it's brand new and nobody has heard of the research so far. So feel free to use this seminar in whatever shape or form makes most sense to you. And Siri, do you want to say something to say hello?
Just a quick hello and welcome. We're thrilled that so many of you are joining today and can't wait to hear your questions. Please feel to pop them into the Q&A function throughout our talk. We'll do our best to keep our eye on the questions as we go along, and certainly we'll make sure to leave plenty of time for interaction at the end. Thank you for being here today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Siri. And with that, let me quickly go and share my screen here. Okay, great. So unless you scream at me, I presume that you can see the screen just fine.
Looks good, Iris. Yep.
Thank you so much, Siri. We thought that I would just actually start with the title, why we chose this title and what we are trying to communicate with our work, maybe at a more fundamental level. And I am going to actually start with the make. We are very passionate, in fact, about every word in this title. And making was important because, as you will see, our goal of the seminar, but also of the book and of the work that we do at the Women in Public Policy program more generally, is very much to go beyond the talking. So this is not about a moral appeal or anything of that sort, but we want people to make something fair, to include this into their daily work, whatever their responsibilities might be, to embed this, to bake it in. So the making actually is important, and I'll share a couple of examples of what that might look like. Work might be self-explanatory in many ways. We are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily focused on the workplace. You'll see sometimes we also talk about schools and universities. So we're defining work broadly, but we are passionate about equalizing the playing field at work for everyone. And then fairness might be the most interesting of the words in our title. But again, we feel quite strongly that what we are trying to achieve here is to truly, and when I say truly, I mean truly, and that's, I'm sure, also something we'll discuss more in the Q&A, truly create equal opportunities for everyone so that everyone can thrive at work. So fairness has very much something to do with equality for us, but also with equity. And Siri, in the second part of our introduction, will talk a bit more about some of the myths that are related to those concepts and how we think about those in our work. Okay, and with that, maybe I'm going to get right into it. So again, those of you who'd like to follow along, this is very much based on the introduction with a bit more original research kind of sharing today. So I've talked a little bit about fairness already, but keep that very much in mind as you hear us describe what the work is about. In the book, we are actually saying that the way we define fairness might be too much for some and might be too little for others. And we don't know, of course, in which category you fall, but tell us. But also keep a bit of an open mind as we are exploring this territory, maybe in particular at this moment in time. Okay. And with that, I want to start with our first example that Siri and I both very much like, because literally it is about life and death. Most of our examples are not about life and death. Mostly our research is not about life and death. But this one, in fact, is because Astrid Linder, an engineer in Sweden, only very recently, together with her team, helped develop the first dummy for cars that is based on a woman's body. So if you think of these crash dummies that have been used over many, many, many years, it appears almost incredible. At least when I first learned about it, I could hardly believe it, that we still thought women were just smaller men who might be looking somewhat different in other ways. It turns out that that actually has cost women dearly. It is not that women have more accidents. In fact, men have more accidents because also men drive more. But if women are in an accident, they are more likely to be hurt because cars are not designed for their bodies. Another example that we really like that I think also speaks to the make part of our title comes from Rihanna. Many of you probably know her beauty line Fenty. And you might also know that it made the news a few years ago because it was one of the early adopters of something that they themselves didn't call inclusive, but in fact turned out to make the world more inclusive for many people, in that they had developed 50 different shades of foundation. We have a quote here from Sandy Saputo. She is the marketing director of Fenty Beauty. Maybe just read it for a moment. So showing rather than telling is very much our mantra as well. And here's another example from a very different place. This is Bavaria, is one of the biggest breweries in Colombia. And they had to design around a law that restricted women from heavy lifting. What the government perceived to be heavy lifting, I have no views on whether it was too heavy or not, but it was a law. And it kept women from work. And so Bavaria aptly realized that they needed to change the production line in their brewery so that everyone could comfortably lift what they needed to lift, and also, of course, was in compliance with the law. Those of you who join us from the Kennedy School and from other universities will be very familiar with this last example here. That is Teachly. It's a bit of technology that colleagues of ours have developed to help all of us teach more fairly. What it does is it helps faculty members keep track of who we call on in a given class. And then before I come back to the classroom for my next lecture, I get literally a sheet. It's not, I don't want to call it a spreadsheet because that doesn't do justice to the elaborate design of the sheet. So I get a sheet with lots of different photos that tells me who I've called on last time, who I should call on this time, that does it in a very behaviorally designed way in that it's color coded. So it makes it very easy for me to not go with people who are marked red, but more likely to go for people who are marked green. So I think that's a very good example of how a little bit of design can help all of us make our work better. And certainly as a faculty member, this makes my life much easier and is much more easy for me to be fair. Now, the last example that I'm showing you here is based actually on some research, and I'm using it to start building that bridge between evidence-based decision-making and then good storytelling. What I've done so far are just sharing with you some stories, and we believe, obviously, in the power of storytelling, and we do that in the book too, but our deeper mission in life is to base whatever we recommend and whatever we share with you today on the best possible evidence available. And this is one of those examples to illustrate a little bit how we go about this. So this is a couple of years ago where the Nobel Prize Foundation reached out to me because they had noted that they, of course, had also given the Nobel Prize to mostly men, mostly white men, mostly men from the Northern Western Hemisphere. And so they invited me to come to Stockholm. And as soon as I arrived, I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And so many things, or most of the things that we discussed and that the foundation then actually did, I can't talk about. But this is an example that they themselves wrote about. And so I have talked about it. It's also included in the book. So when I arrived, I came with a form that looked a little bit similar to what you have in front of you. It's the form that I have received for many, many years, inviting me to nominate one person for the Nobel Prize in economics. It turns out that our research and others has shown that when we focus on this one person at a time, we are much more likely to go back to the stereotype. Because a big insight in behavioral science is that everything is relative. Whether you like the coffee that you're drinking, I'm drinking tea today, for example, whether I like the tea that I'm drinking, whether I'm comfortable with the temperature in this room, whether you like my accent or not, has something to do with the types of accents, the types of temperatures, the types of teas that you are used to. So you calibrate based on what you know best. And that's exactly what we hypothesize our minds are doing as well. In particular, when we look at one person at a time, because we use these reference basically to calibrate our judgments. And because we don't have other people available, we use a stereotype. And so when I went to Stockholm, I suggested to them to ask people like me to nominate more than one person at a time, basically to force my mind to go beyond the stereotype and start thinking about real people and thinking about these choices more in a bundle than one off. So let me go back for just a moment and tell you about one of the papers that this was built on. Later, some colleagues of ours, Edward Chang, who was at the business school, and others, actually ran a similar experiment that found very similar results. So that's why I normally cite both papers. But that was our early thinking about this in 2016. And it's called When Performance Trumps Gender Bias. joint versus separate evaluation. And that's quite literally what we meant at the time, that we make different decisions when we look at individuals separately. That means one at a time, as compared to when we look at them jointly. And so let me quickly take you back to basically our original study design. I'm also doing this to illustrate a bit what the baseline for some of the research that we're sharing with you is. Sometimes we build on laboratory research. And what I'm going to show you is a lab experiment. More often in our book, we base our assessments on field experiments. And Siri will share with you a field experiment that we recently conducted. So we wanted to just give you a bit of a sense of the typical methodology that we use. And in all experiments, whether that's in the lab or the field, we use basic experimental instructions where you have a treatment group and a control group, maybe sometimes more than one treatment group, and you keep everything's identical. And then you want to compare how these different groups behave based on whatever you're interested in evaluating. So here is a very, very simple design. And we did this with lots of different tasks, not just with a math task, but we typically chose gender stereotypical tasks. So that could be, for example, a verbal task where traditionally we believe women to be outperforming men, or a math task where the stereotype, although no longer reality, but the stereotype still is such that we think men are better at math. And what we did was something quite simple. We either showed people one person at a time or two people at the time, and they had to hire them for a math task or a verbal task. And the people who chose then were paid based on these people's performance. We call this incentive compatible, in the sense that we really wanted these people, these evaluators, to take the task very seriously and choose the best people they could think of. Now, the design was a bit more complicated than what I'm just describing to you now in this short introduction, but that's kind of basically it. And then we had either high-performing candidates, so they were performing better than the average, and people knew this, or they were below the average, and people also knew this. So the evaluators had perfect information, and the information we gave them was based on these, let's call them workers, and past performance. So the workers first did some of these math tasks, some of the math tasks, some of the verbal tasks, and they got a score. So there's lots of information here, but also a little bit of noise in that we also indicated gender. We give some other filler information about these people, that they're from the Boston area, the kind of age range, other things. And then we just see who people choose. And what we find is that when people look at one person at a time, they basically go with the stereotypes. These are the numbers that you see here. You also see that people don't really differentiate very much between high, I'm going to just call them higher than average performers and low performers. And sometimes it's even reversed. This wasn't statistically significant, but basically what you have to take away from here is that there's a preference for the stereotype when you look at one person at a time. Now, what if we give people more than one person at a time? Now they're able to compare and calibrate. Right now, performance becomes much more salient. And basically what you see is that the gender stereotype disappears and low performers are really hurt, which is why we called this paper When Performance Trumps Gender Bias, because that's exactly what happened here. So, sorry, I'm trying to turn this off for some reason. Okay, now I think I'm good. Okay. Sorry, I thought I turned this off, but somehow okay. So my apologies, we'll have a little bit of background noise because I turned it off before, but somehow I wasn't successful. Okay, so now I'm back. So the message here is that when we look at people one at a time, that's the problem, that we're much more likely to go back to this referent, namely the stereotype, which is not happening when we look at more than one person. Now, when I went to Stockholm, of course, I didn't tell them that I had tested this on Nobel laureates because I hadn't. But I basically told them about the research and why I thought that possibly they should try this out. And that's the new form now, which asks people like me to nominate more than one person. Okay, so that was a little bit of a warm-up. And this is just a quick preview before I'm turning it over to Siri. In that, generally, you'll see we have three big themes in the seminar. The first one is focused on counting. And when we say counting, we mean everything, literally counting numbers, representation, looking at pay gaps, counting how much money people make. So measuring is very, very important for us. Often you need to measure before you can even diagnose what's broken. And then you need to measure again to evaluate the impact of something. So that's important, but it also includes accountability, which you'll see later on in the seminar is going to be very important to us. So that's a bit of a first part of the seminar. A second part of the seminar then focuses on making something stick. So now that we have counted, we have evaluated, we have used numbers to promote sometimes some change, we have to think about how to make something sustainable. So the sticking is much more about building this in, about the making of something. How do we embed these new insights into how we hire, how we promote, how we think about organizational design more generally? And then the last part, in many ways, is the most interesting part, also the most difficult part. And that is how we can make it normal, how we can make fairness the norm, literally the norm. And you'll see that in that part, we'll talk about norm entrepreneurship. We'll talk about how social comparisons matter, how people care about what others think, and how we can use those types of motivational forces in the interest of fairness. Okay, and with that, I'm going to come back at the end to give just a little preview of the next seminar. But with that, I am now going to stop sharing my screen. And please hold your thoughts for just a moment because we're turning it over to Siri right away, and then we'll open it for Q&A at the very end.
Perfect. Thank you, Iris. And just a quick reminder to please put any of those questions into the chat because we are, pardon me, the Q&A function, because we're excited to see them. So before we can make fairness count and stick and normal, we want to clear out of the way some common myths that have become the foundation for some practices and efforts to increase workplace fairness that haven't moved the needle enough, haven't been as effective as we need them to be. So today I'd like to share with you four of those myths. We cover a few more in the book. The first is that we need to debias individuals in order to make our workplaces more fair. A few years ago, representatives from many of the largest companies in the United States visited the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, as they do almost every year, to hire graduating students for jobs, entry-level jobs in these companies. And 90% of the visiting recruiters reported that increasing racial and gender diversity among their hires was a key priority. Of course, in addition to things like finding the best students in terms of GPA, students with relevant past work experience and internship experiences. But the results show that unfortunately, these recruiters, despite their best intentions, fell short. Women and students of color needed a higher GPA, higher grade point average than white male students to be evaluated on par. And white men also received 50% more credit for their prestigious summer internship experiences compared to women and students of color with those exact same internships. So despite their best intentions, these recruiters were not able to help their unconscious biases from factoring into their evaluation. The evaluation procedures and processes that they had in place didn't protect them from those biases, which all of us humans share. We're all unconsciously biased. We know this to be a fact of life. But research has shown very consistently that good news, we don't need to debias our brains in order to make less biased decisions. That's good news because we haven't actually yet uncovered a way to reliably debias human brains. It's either incredibly difficult or maybe even impossible. What we can do, though, and what turns out to be highly effective, is debiasing the systems and structures that we surround ourselves with. So let me give you an example of that based on the very recent paper that Iris referenced a moment ago that just was published in the journal Science about 10 days ago. This is joint work with our co-authors, Edward Chang, Chenson Arslan, and Oliver Hauser. And we did, in fact, look at the hiring context again. In a large multinational telecommunications and engineering firm, our field study randomized more than 3,000 managers who were about to hire for an open role on their teams. In fact, more than 10,000 hiring decisions were in scope for this experiment. And we divided these participating managers into three groups. One was the control group, or the business as usual. They would simply get an email saying, "You've raised a requisition. Here's the applications that you've received for this open position." In our two experimental groups, managers, before getting access to those submitted applications, were invited to watch a 7-minute training video. Now, these two training videos were very similar in many ways. Managers saw them right before they made the hiring decision. The training video was tailored to the hiring decisions that they were about to make. So we talked explicitly about how to make this decision, how to think about it. And the training was delivered by senior leaders in the company, both senior business side leaders as well as senior HR leaders who were known to employees and who had a high degree of credibility in the company. The major difference between the two videos was that one of them talked explicitly about diversity, the fact that it was a core value of the company, and that managers were encouraged to screen for different backgrounds, different capabilities, and different perspectives that new hires could bring to their existing teams. Whereas the other video, which we called the effectiveness training condition, didn't mention diversity explicitly, but instead talked about how to think about hiring for different capabilities to increase the overall effectiveness of the team. And then we looked at who managers actually decided to shortlist, as well as ultimately hire for their open positions. And here is what we found. We looked at both women as well as non-nationals, which this company defined as applicants whose nationality was different from the location of the job they were applying to. So if I'm a national of France and I'm applying to a job in the US or in India, I'm considered a non-national applicant. And indeed, we found that the behaviorally designed diversity training was able to yield some real results and shift actual outcomes. Women were 12% more likely to be shortlisted by managers who were exposed to the diversity training than those managers in the control condition who didn't watch any video. Similarly, non-national applicants were 13% more likely to be shortlisted and 20% more likely to be hired by managers in the diversity training condition. And finally, female non-nationals, which were a small group and the group that had been overwhelmingly least likely to get hired in the first place, they were 28% more likely to be shortlisted and 41% more likely to be hired. Now, these percentages I've highlighted, they are the statistically significant results that we found, and they all pertain to the diversity training, the version of the training that explicitly mentioned diversity. The effectiveness training, that's the blue bars in the graph, had directionally similar results, but they were not statistically significant. So the takeaway from all of this is that instead of debiasing brains by shifting our procedures, in this case by implementing a small diversity training intervention that reminded managers of the importance of the decision that they were making and the importance of considering diversity as part of that decision, meaningfully changed the hiring outcomes. I do have to point out that this diversity training is very different from the types of diversity trainings or unconscious bias trainings that most organizations have today, which, as a matter of fact, have been studied extensively over decades and overwhelmingly have not been found to change behavior. Those trainings are typically not delivered in a timely fashion. It might be, you might get a module as part of onboarding, or just once a year, you have to do some kind of diversity training, but it's often not timed to the moments that matter when you're about to make consequential decisions. The content of those trainings also often is not tailored to the everyday decisions that people are making, whether it's hiring, performance evaluations, promotions, or anything else. And oftentimes trainings are delivered either by external consultants or facilitators or other people that might not be so well known to employees. So we hope that this paper and this research finding will catalyze organizations who choose to still invest in diversity training to hopefully follow this proof of concept and make training timely, specific, and to consider carefully who delivers it. We also hope that this training impresses on you all and all of your organizations more broadly the need to evaluate the effectiveness of what we are doing. That has not been prevalent enough in this fairness space. We do this all the time in marketing, in sales, in advertising. We're A/B testing different messages. Amazon is giving different consumers different pricing to see how price sensitive consumers are. This concept of experimentation is something that companies do in other realms, but we need to bring it to the realm of fairness as well. And I just want to give you one small example of why indeed that's so important. This example comes from Ericsson, a telecommunications company which a couple of years ago partnered with More Than Now, a behavioral consulting practice in London, to run an experiment with the aim of increasing internal mobility, especially among women. Ericsson had seen in their data that men in the company were more likely to move across geographies, try different roles in different functions than women were. And in their company, that was one of the key precursors to career advancement. So they tested 4 different messages to encourage employees to explore these internal mobility opportunities. Specifically, the outcome that they were looking for was people visiting the company's internal job site as a result of getting an email. The control version of the email simply said, here's our internal mobility site, please check it out. And then there were 3 other messages that they tested. And in fact, only one of those, the message that said, you do not have to be 100% qualified to explore these opportunities, only that message was successful in closing the gender gap. The other 2 messages that they tested actually exacerbated the gender gap because it led to more men than women pursuing the opportunities and visiting the internal mobility site. So this is just a reminder that even the best intentions and the kind of best hypotheses can sometimes backfire. So it's incredibly important to run pilot tests, to run little A/B tests or randomized control trials to actually see what the effects of our process changes and our interventions are. So that's the first myth. The second myth is this idea that fairness is the responsibility of DEI professionals or even of HR professionals alone. Most companies, there are dedicated PR specialists or communications professionals who handle the company's highest profile communications, such as writing the annual report or preparing the CEO speeches. But at the same time, in every organization, employees up and down the hierarchy are doing things like writing emails, speaking up in meetings, and communicating through slide decks or by creating spreadsheets on a daily basis. In other words, everyone in the organization does have to have a base level of communication skills in order for the organization to function, even though they are experts too. And Iris and I would argue that this is exactly the case with fairness as well. Absolutely, specialists can play a very important role in sharing evidence-based practices, helping to evaluate them, helping to propagate them throughout organizations. But if we're going to really embed fairness into our everyday work the way that we need to, it needs to become part of every single person's job. Now, the good news is that doesn't mean that you have to start a whole new role or even join a task force or take on another training. All it means is that you do what you already are doing, but just a little bit better and a little bit smarter by embedding a fairness lens, such as those recruiters on the University of Pennsylvania or the hiring managers in our large global company. They were still doing what they were doing, but surrounded by slightly better processes, they were able to make better decisions. The next myth I want to talk about is the idea that fairness is not compatible with meritocracy. Meritocracy has become a bit of a buzzword recently. I had to go look up the formal definition, actually, and it is a system in which people advance or are given power according to their skills and capabilities. So let me tell you a little story of what happened in the school district in Broward County, Florida. It's the country's 6th largest school district, and it serves more than 250,000 learners. In Broward County, they used to have a system for identifying what they called gifted students with particularly high IQ scores, whereby teachers or parents could refer students to be tested. And if they scored above a certain threshold on the test, then they would get put into the so-called gifted students program, where they would get access to more one-on-one coaching, more advanced simulation mentoring, harder coursework, and so forth. Under that old model, where students needed to be proactively referred by their parents or teachers, Black students made up 12% and Hispanic students made up 16% of the participants in the gifted student program, even though they collectively, students of color, were more than half of all the learners in the school district. But then a systems change happened. Broward County moved to a new system whereby all second graders were screened using the same test as before. Same test, same score cutoffs, but now all second graders would take that test. And lo and behold, the system redesign uncovered large numbers of students, especially students of color, whose potential and giftedness had been previously overlooked. As a result of the system change, the participation of Black students in the gifted program increased by 80%, and the participation of Hispanic students increased by 130%. So it was not a matter of the students having the capability or the potential. It was that we had a tough time, the administrators, the parents, the students in the school system had a tough time spotting that potential in certain students. In fact, Iris and I write in the book, and I quote, "The world is not a meritocracy where the best people rise to the top purely based on their superior capabilities. It turns out that having someone see and recognize your potential and then having a system in place for nurturing it is a big piece of the puzzle." It's not that meritocracy isn't an incredibly worthwhile ideal to strive for. It's that the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that the world has never seen a full meritocracy in action yet. There are still a lot of systemic barriers in the way, preventing some people from having access or opportunity, or simply making the playing field unlevel so that not everyone has that equal shot of succeeding to their full potential. And that's why it's so incredibly important to change the systems that we have, like Broward County did for their schools. The last myth I want to tackle very quickly is this idea that your gain equals my loss, or that the world is a zero-sum game. Now, of course, there are some real zero-sum situations. We just had elections in the United States recently. We have 435 seats in the US House of Representatives. We can't have more representatives than that. But most situations in life are not zero-sum this way, even though our beliefs about zero-sum tend to be more prevalent than the actual situations. Consider the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which was instituted in the United States in 1990. It wanted to make participation in society and in everyday life more accessible for people with mobility challenges and other disabilities. So things like curb cuts, smooth edges at the edges of curbs, installing ramps, having elevators available instead or in addition to escalators or stairs. At that time in 1990, about 4% of the US population had a mobility disability, which meant that they benefited from these changes directly. And actually, that share has grown to 12% of the population, or about 30 million people in the US today. So that's already important. But in fact, all people benefited from these changes. Maybe you've had your leg in a cast at one point or another in life. Maybe you've taken public transit to the airport with a heavy bag and you really appreciated being able to take the elevator instead of lugging your bag, or a bike for that matter, up the stairs. Or maybe you've ever been out and about in public with a stroller. This redesign of the physical environment that was initially inspired by the differential needs of people with mobility challenges turned out to make the world a better place for everybody. And that is, in fact, exactly what we argue fairness can do for all of us in our organizations, too. By redesigning our procedures and practices to make them more of a level playing field, we can ensure that all of us have an equal opportunity to succeed to our full potential. We can ensure that the right people can work in the right roles at the right times so that organizations can reach their highest potential, and so that our society collectively can become more prosperous. And this, we hope, is the promise of making work fair. So with that, let me stop sharing the slides so that we can see you all, and we would love to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Iris and Siri, for that great overview. It's so timely. I know there's a lot of questions in the Q&A that we can get to, but really appreciate you addressing all the widespread myths around this work with rigorous evidence and research at this time. Again, a reminder for folks to please add your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will read them out. There's several questions just to start off around the current landscape and the climate for diversity, equity, and inclusion and fairness here in the US. Specifically, folks are asking how we can move this work forward, given some of the recent anti-DEI rhetoric and executive orders here in the US. And how can we move forward the recommendations in your book specifically during this time?
Thank you. So I'm happy to take that question. So clearly, this is very much on everyone's mind, and we appreciate the worries, the concerns, the pain that many of you are feeling in this country. So first, I do have to clarify that we are not lawyers, so we cannot give you legal advice. So some of the questions I saw in the Q&A are very much about, so what do we do now? I don't think as researchers, as behavioral economists, that's what we can deliver. You do need to talk to a lawyer. Having said this, we very much come from the place that Siri just described, where we would very much argue that if we wanted to give meritocracy a chance, we first have to make the world more fair. And that's a bit our take right now. We recently wrote an op-ed on that, which is not out yet, so we'll see whether somebody's interested in it, but where we were trying to clarify what would it take for a meritocracy to become reality. And Siri reminded us of the many barriers that we face today. In fact, we start the article with Supreme Court Judge Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman to serve on the US Supreme Court. And she graduated from Stanford Law School in 1952 on top of her class, and she became a legal secretary. This wasn't her choice, but these were the constraints that she was facing at the time. So going back now to the 60s is not going to move us closer to meritocracy. In fact, there's a really nice paper that we talk about in the book, but also in the article, that measures how much GDP per capita in the United States has grown because of the restrictions that were in place in the 60s that kept many women, kept people of color out of many jobs. How much those removing those restrictions, how much they have contributed to GDP per person. And that's about 40%. So that is huge, right? And that's GDP per capita. So that's a bit of our take here, that we can't afford as a country. And also we can't afford, of course, morally, but I'm not talking now about morality, right? I am very much about the human rights case, but I'm now talking a bit about the economic case, that we cannot afford to go back to the 60s, because we would lose out on enormous amounts of talent, and people wouldn't be, as Siri just said, wouldn't be in the right jobs at the right time, right? We don't want people like Sandra Day O'Connor to work as legal secretaries unless that is what they choose to do, and that's where the returns are the highest. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer, in the sense that it's a very difficult situation right now. We don't think we are in the business of making people care, but we are very much in the business of helping those who do care more effectively. Mm-hmm. And in that, we still have quite a number of organizations which are interested in working with us and building in fairness into everything they do. Siri, please.
Yeah, I'll just jump off right from where you finished, Iris. There was another question that I just saw come through about, when it feels like everyone is against this mission of fairness, how do you proceed? And sometimes what tends to happen, especially in our modern media landscape, is the most extreme voices get a disproportionate share of voice. And I think what we see anecdotally and in also talking with many companies is that there are more people than you would think based on consuming the media who continue to care about fairness, who believe in the pursuit of fairness, and who are sort of willing to be your allies and co-conspirators in this work. And I think one very powerful approach is to focus on the people who already get it. Instead of worrying about converting the hearts and minds of those who don't seem positively disposed, to say, okay, but what about all of us who already understand that this is important? Instead of focusing on the one senior leader that might be against our work, how far could we get by just tapping into the energy and motivation of all of those folks who already get it? We have featured so many stories in the book of these types of instances because we wanted to show how much it's possible to accomplish when you speak to the proverbial choir and just start by saying, hey, I know many of you share my motivation in leveling the playing field. Well, here's something that I tried on my team, or here's a new process change that we made in our division that helped us. Maybe you might want to consider it too. The fundamental message of our book is that fairness is not a program, but it is a way of doing things, a way of doing all the things that we are already doing anyway in our organizations. We're having meetings, we're doing social events, we're hiring people, we're evaluating their performance, we are putting people onto projects or assigning people work, we are paying them, we are promoting them. So these are the everyday actions and processes that we have to tackle to make work fair. And I think because those things need to happen anyway, regardless of macroeconomic conditions, regardless of who is the president of any given country, once you embed fairness into those processes, it's also more sticky, more likely to last.
Great, thank you both. That was really helpful. I know a lot of people in the chat have been asking that question, so thank you for your very thorough answer. There's another question in the Q&A from Elena about the joint evaluation study that you mentioned, Iris, and what happens to joint versus separate evaluation bias when the evaluators are a committee or a group of people, and so comparing that individual bias with group bias when it comes to joint evaluations.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a very good question. And it hasn't been studied with specifically joint versus separate evaluation, but many people have studied the degree to which an individual as compared to a group fall prey to biases. So I'm going to just answer the more generic question here. And, maybe not surprisingly, the results are a little bit all over the place. And they are all over the place mostly because a group is not always functioning well. So there's lots of research, right, on how to make groups make better decisions beyond bias. So let's forget bias for a moment. Lots of research on showing that groups fall into groupthink, for example, where the loudest voice prevails and we don't actually hear all the 6 different voices at the table. And so it all depends on how your group decision-making is structured. So if you have a wise approach to group decision-making, then having more heads at the table, more bodies at the table, is actually a good thing. And it will help you make better decisions, including less biased decisions. But if you have a badly functioning team where, for example, the loudest voice dominates everyone else, or where you easily fall prey to stereotypes and you don't have a structured process, for example, to go about your decision making, then you're much more likely to fall prey to bias. So in that sense, it's not just it depends, right? That's a little bit an academic trick. We always say it depends. It's not just it depends, but we know what it depends on. It depends on how you structure group decision making.
Great, thank you, Iris. Kind of a follow-up from that question, Paige asks if you can elaborate more on how performance evaluations at work at large can be systemically improved to be more fair.
Yes, no, I don't want to dominate, but that's, of course, another question that I have done some research on. So we do have a whole chapter on performance management, promotions, And literally just today, as Siri knows this, I have a deadline on a performance appraisal paper. So it's very, very much on my mind. I don't know, I can answer it very quickly. I'll try a quick answer, but also promise that we will get back to you literally in like, I don't know, 5 weeks or so, where we have a whole session on that very topic. But okay, so very quickly, performance appraisals are the home of bias, sadly. And they're the home of bias because mostly these are subjective performance appraisals where we don't have objective information available. And if we could actually count the number of witches that you produce, that is different from evaluating whether somebody is a leader, say, in the organization. Even as I say leader, right, you already surely have lots of stereotypes and lots of biases, and you know the research that we don't necessarily associate leadership with women, and so lots of research in that space. So that's the challenge that we have with performance appraisal. Just to make it very clear, it's very, very hard. Nobody does it well. Nobody likes giving them. Nobody likes receiving them. So there's also psychology, you know, that we are of our minds, that we are very sensitive to negative feedback or critical feedback. And we overweight critical feedback, even though there's maybe 20 things that are very positive. So it's just a fraught environment. But what we are trying to do is literally, you know, parse out the different pieces of the performance appraisal process that we could improve. So the paper that I'm currently working on, that I'm not going to summarize now in 1 minute, but focuses on one of these aspects, namely that in many appraisal processes, we ask individuals to self-appraise first, and then share the self-evaluations of our managers. And so our worry had been, and confirmed in this research, that if there are either gender differences, cross-cultural differences, racial differences, any differences in seniority, for example, in people's ability to accurately reflect their performance, maybe some of us are too humble. Maybe some of us have hubris and we exaggerate our performance, then that could lead to a vicious circle where managers basically copy and paste, so to speak, not literally, but are very influenced by, in fact, we call this social influence, by the anchor that we as employees might throw out there for our managers. So that's kind of our approach. That's just one example, but that's a bit our approach to performance management, really trying to identify how could we make it better, realizing that it's a very tall order, and of all the things that we're doing, performance management or performance feedback in particular and appraisals are a very hard one.
Perfect. Thank you, Iris. There's another few questions about kind of our language and messaging around diversity and inclusion work. Shreya asks, she sees they see a large gap in understanding what DEI actually means among the general public in the current political landscape, and how do we shift our language and messaging to combat this? And then Patricia also had a question around kind of the language of fairness specifically that you both use in the book, and if there's one way to navigate that current backlash.
Yeah, those are great questions. Language is really important. It shapes how we conceptualize things, and it really frames the conversation. So we thought long and hard about the decision to call the book Make Work Fair and to center it on this concept of fairness. Let me tell you why, and let me tell you why we landed on that. There's a lot of research to suggest that fairness is actually a fundamental value shared by both humans. Children as young as 4, 5, and 6 start to have very clear definitions of fairness, and they react very strongly toward perceived unfairness. So that's one. And we've also seen that reflected anecdotally in our work with organizations and practitioners. I've personally never encountered a senior leader, regardless of who they are, who would have objected to the concept of fairness and said, no, I don't care about running a high-performing organization. I actually want to have a cronyistic system in my company. We've just never come across that. People, of course, sometimes have different definitions of what fairness means. They might have different opinions about what are the best ways to get there. But we truly feel that this idea of a fair level playing field where everyone has at least an equal opportunity and an equal shot at success is one that a majority of people can get behind. And once we agree on that goal, then we can look back and say, okay, what are the most effective ways to get to that goal? What are the specific interventions or actions that will get us there? Because just like when you're driving around, if you're going from point A to point B, there's usually multiple routes you can take. One of them might be more scenic. One of them might be the fastest. One of them might involve the least tolls, right? So there's different trade-offs that you then make along the way. But there's hardly ever just one way to get from A to B. But if you don't know where B is, it's almost impossible to get there. And so one of the things that we want and are hoping to contribute into this conversation is a very clear vision of what the end goal is, what fairness actually looks like, which is dismantling these barriers that have for too long kept some groups behind. And then we can bring the evidence bear to show which paths would get us there fastest, which paths would get us there easiest, or with the least investment. Iris, do you want to add anything to that?
Great, thank you both. Another question in the chat around, I know your book has a lot of audiences too. You talk about CEOs and the work they can do, but also DEI practitioners, activists, beyond. But Ricky had a question specifically about DEI practitioners and how they're often expected to deliver unrealistic results and debias staff and decision makers and have a very large charge in their fields. How can DEI practitioners generate confidence in the co-creation and experimental approach that the two of you talk about in your book, especially in a context where the time and resources allocated to DEI are siloed, isolated, and under-resourced?
So first of all, we share your pain. We've worked with many organizations and have encountered exactly the challenge that you just described about under-resourcing, underappreciation, not enough expertise. Like I remember one organization where I was like, well, you use the data science team to cut cost. No, you should use the data science team to analyze the DEI data and really understand whether we are doing a good job right now when we hire or in our performance appraisals, or, you know, the pay gap, for example, is another favorite of ours, to really unleash the data on the problem. So we have been frustrated, although if you are in the role, I totally get it, that I haven't quite experienced the degree of frustration that you must have experienced. So I think that's hard. In the book, what we're trying to argue is that, you know, we shouldn't think about the DEI as so different from other capacities, competencies, and pieces of expertise that we need when we do our work. So most of us have to write memos. Most of us have to sometimes have to give a presentation. There's a lot of things that we have to do that involves writing, speaking. And still we do have a corporate communications office in the larger companies, of course, but also in the public sector. So we're not thinking that therefore it's irrelevant how I write or how I talk, but all of us need some expertise to do this well. And so the communications office can be a hub of experts, right, that I can turn to, get advice on an op-ed, for example, that we might want to write, or a talk that we might want to give. But I'm not delegating that work to somebody else. And I feel very strongly about that, which was, so if I added something to Siri, which was a bit of a reason why we felt like we needed a different term, fairness. And as you might imagine, we wrote this book way before the current moment in time. We had no idea the book would come out at this very moment. But fairness felt to us, and we also wanted to signal something different. We wanted to signal that this is about everyone. This isn't out here as a program series. It's not a program that is out here, but it should be embedded into everything. We need to measure what works, etc. So it's a bit of a whole approach that we're trying to communicate with the word fairness that goes beyond maybe a value judgment, but also talks about this particular approach. It's about doing things and about all of us doing things.
And the fact that it can benefit everybody is really important. I think in practice, many DEI initiatives and organizations, the so-called corporate DEI of the last few years, were intended to do exactly that. They were intended to make life better for everybody, but sometimes the messaging got lost in translation, where in some cases it was perceived as a special program to lift certain groups up. And that may have been part of the backlash that kind of was generated recently. So I think reframing and resetting the conversation so that everyone understands that we all benefit when we live in a fairer world is a really important part of this conversation.
Great. Thank you both so much. I know we're almost at time today, but really appreciate both of your perspectives and leadership in this work. And thank you all for your great questions as well and for engaging with us. And I'll pass it to Iris to close us out today.
Thank you so much, Anisha, and thank you, Siri, for joining me in this opening seminar. So next week, we want to get more into some concrete things that we could be doing. And we're starting with the most obvious one in many ways, namely data. So how can we use data? How can we use data productively to inform what's broken, to evaluate what works? And we combine that then with a discussion about goals. So again, kind of using the types of approaches that we normally use in our organizations when we want to achieve something. We're starting with the end state, so to speak, and then we're kind of going back and trying to understand, okay, how do we get from A to B, as Siri said? What steps do we have to take in between? And we're joined by Erica Kyrgios of the University of Chicago, who is going to share some of her work on the importance of data and goals. And with that, thank you all very much for joining us today, and we'll see you next week. Have a good rest.
Thank you so much.